This week I'm going to speak primarily about the Old World. Make no mistake, in the 15th century, and long before, the epicenter of the Old World was China. China, China, China. China had the most people, it had the largest, most organized state, it was arguably the most technologically advanced place in the Old World. And most importantly, they made stuff in China that everyone else in the world wanted. In particular, the obvious things are silk and porcelain, but there were many more, not least black pepper from Southeast Asia and spices in general. This may seem like a small thing, but it's not. In a world before refrigeration, spices were how people preserved food. So about half of this trade occurred overland, right, between China and the Mediterranean, via what was called the Silk Road, a long, dangerous path through Central Asia that's functioned as a sort of merchant highway for thousands of years. And about half of the trade occurred overseas, via the Indian Ocean. There was always room for one or two other major empires in the midst of this, if they could position themselves in the middle of these trade routes between the Middle East and China. The largest of these ever was the Mongol Empire, which literally conquered both sides of the spectrum, laying waste to entire cities as they did so. The Mongols appeared seemingly overnight in the early 13th century and more or less flamed out by the end of the 14th century. This happened for an interesting reason. The Mongols were so good and so thorough at administering overland trade between China and the Middle East that the Silk Road in the 14th century was the safest and most efficient it had ever been. More people traveled along its path, meaning merchants, missionaries, entire armies in some cases, than had ever done so before. And with them came diseases, the bubonic plague in particular. So the Mongols inadvertently unleashed upon the Old World a tidal wave of infectious disease, one which halved the populations of most of the Old World's major urban centers in a century, less than that really. So in the 15th century, they were replaced by an Islamic empire, the Ottomans. The Ottomans were Muslims, so in some way they continued the tradition of previous Islamic empires of fighting endless wars with Christian kingdoms of Western Europe over places that contained sites of religious significance to both. The religious significance was not necessarily ever the reason for fighting, but that's a story for another day. The apex of Ottoman power arrived in 1453, when the Ottoman armies overran the Christian city of Constantinople, now Istanbul, up until then the capital city of Orthodox or Eastern Christianity. Right? In Spain, meanwhile, at the southwestern tip of Europe, another group of Christian kingdoms were fighting with another group of Muslims. Spain had, since the 8th century, been, for all intents and purposes, an outpost of the large Islamic empire that covered much of North Africa. It was a pluralistic society they created, with large numbers of Christians and Jews tolerated by Muslim rulers. But Spain was also a political objective for the Holy Roman Empire, as well as the powerful political families of southern Europe. Now, the right combination of church support and dynastic marriages between wealthy and influential families meant that by the latter half of the 15th century, Catholic armies were able to overrun much of the Iberian Peninsula. That's where Spain and Portugal are. And doing so, they were able to bring it back under control of the church. Now, the final stage of this operation came in 1492, when the Muslim kingdom of Granada, at the southernmost point in Spain, practically swimming distance from North Africa, fell to the armies of Ferdinand and Isabel. Spain was now Christian, and its Muslim and Jewish residents were faced with the choice of fleeing with whatever they could carry, converting to Catholicism, or being tortured and then painfully executed as non-believers. So this brings us to a key point. By 1492, when Granada fell, and coincidentally, Columbus and his crew arrived in Cuba the same year, Europe in general, and Southern Europe in particular, was a profoundly militarized society. It wasn't just war that was part of everyday life, but holy war. So the first Europeans to arrive in large numbers in the Americas were called conquistadors, and they were professional soldiers who sort of evolved in the crucible of these wars, with the Islamic empires. And they saw the world, for the most part, as divided into Christians and heathens, locked in an intractable conflict. So this explains a great deal, as you're going to see, about what happened when they first arrived in the Americas. So if you want to take the Middle Ages as a conflict between Christians and Muslims, which it wasn't by any means that simple, but let's just pretend for a second, then I guess you could say that the Christians lost Constantinople, but they gained the Iberian Peninsula, all in a relatively short period of time, all within a generation, really. Now, in 1491, that would have sounded like a pretty raw deal. The Atlantic, as far as anyone was aware, was just a vast swath of cold, unpredictable ocean with China and India somewhere far, far on the other side, whereas Constantinople at that time was considered the gateway to the riches of Asia, right? Now, initially, after the conquest, the Portuguese used improved sailing technology to sail down the western coast of Africa, trading in slaves and guns. That's what they were interested in. But as the technology, the sailing technology, continued to improve, people began to venture out into the Atlantic, out of sight of land. Now, so it turned out to be a pretty good deal after all, because the Atlantic Passage would end up giving Europe more or less exclusive access to several things. One, lots of new gold and silver, right? Something they'd had a perpetual deficit of because they could never interest Far Eastern markets up until that point in their goods, right? Number two, gave them access to unlimited land for grazing livestock. Important again for reasons that we'll see next week. And three, it gave them unlimited land for cultivating sugar, which before that had really only been obtainable from India and was an extremely desirable commodity. And of course, there was the existing population of the Americas standing in the way of all these things, but again, that's something we'll talk about next week. So, as we'll see, the Columbian Exchange triggered a permanent shift in the balance of power in the Old World. For thousands of years, goods had gone from China to the rest of Eurasia, and capital had flowed in the opposite direction, right? In the 16th century, this began to change very rapidly, right? Largely because of the European presence in the Americas. The effects were felt in Europe, where wealth and political power grew very rapidly. They were felt in China, where trade revenues plummeted, rampant inflation devalued their silver, and their previously meek trading partners in the West became emboldened and, by their perspective, arrogant. Now, this whole change certainly affected Africa, also a place we haven't maybe spoken about enough so far. In Africa, where the coastal slave trade, which had existed since antiquity, suddenly exploded, feeding an insatiable demand for labor in the new sugar plantations being established throughout the New World. And as for how all of these things affected the people who lived in the New World, well, we'll talk about that next week. Okay?